Welcome to Ingenium On Demand.
Hello, and thank you for coming to the Mind the Gap, Gender and Sexuality in STEM presentation presented by ENGIneQueers Canada and myself. My name is Rhys Herzberg. I am the Western Regional Director of ENGIneQueers Canada, and I have a history of providing inclusivity training at various levels of student government, including local, regional, and national. I'm here on behalf of ENGIneQueers Canada, which is a student-run organization that advocates for inclusivity and diversity in STEM fields, with an emphasis on intersectionality and queer visibility. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Though we find ourselves in different places during these times, we all work and live on the ancestral territories of the Indigenous nations of this land we now call Canada. I am presenting to you from the unceded ancestral land of the Syilx people of the Okanagan Nation. Many of you are familiar with and work around Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 land, the ancestral home of many Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Cree nations, including the Broken Head Ojibwe, the Sagkeeng, the Long Plain, the Peguis, the Roseau River Anishinaabe, the Sandy Bay, and the Swan Lake nations. We're going to begin this presentation with some basic definitions. We want to make sure that everyone is on the same page with the foundational knowledge and everyone has the correct language to further their education after this presentation is done. You'll have to excuse me for referring to engineering once in a while during my examples, as I come from an engineering background and my lack of expertise in geoscience is interrupted only by the existence of geologists in my life at family gatherings. These are our three biggest definitions. When we talk about inclusivity, we're going to be referring to practices or policies that focus on the inclusion of people who otherwise may be marginalized or excluded. Intersectionality refers to the interconnected nature of different aspects of personal identity as they relate to one another. Intersectionality is a very holistic approach to inclusivity. It takes into account the way that aspects of identity like class or race or gender interact with one another and affect the way that we conduct our lives. Inclusivity and intersectionality are related. Working to be inclusive means acknowledging that people have different and unique identities that may be comprised of any combination of human experiences. And when we talk about diversity, particularly in a workplace setting, we're referring to the different experiences, characteristics, and identities that exist between different individuals. Inclusivity promotes diversity because it allows for diversity. The alternative is exclusion. But how do we become exclusionary? ENGIneQueers breaks it down into a pretty simple overview of a three-step process. We begin with stereotypes, which are thoughts or perceptions pertaining to an entire group of people. So my example here is telling a joke about white trash, which is something that I heard a lot growing up. Prejudice, on the other hand, is an internalized belief about an entire group of people. Using the same example, believing that people in poverty are in poverty because of a poor work ethic is an example of prejudice. Finally, discrimination is prejudice that is acted upon, whether verbally, physically, through policy, or however. When we act on prejudice, we become discriminatory. And not all discrimination is purposeful. Consider facial recognition software. A 2019 US study found that Black or Asian individuals had higher rates of false positives in facial recognition software by factors between 10 up to 100. However, for facial recognition softwares developed in Asian countries, the difference between the false positive rates of Caucasian individuals and Asian individuals was negligible, showing that including those considerations in our planning affects the end product that we create. When we are not inclusive in our planning, our design, and our workplaces, we can overlook entire groups of people. But this presentation focuses especially on gender and sexuality. Some of this will be familiar when I go over these terms, and some of it might be new to you, but that's the nature of these types of discussions. If you'd ever like to know more, follow up, or have questions that aren't addressed in this presentation, I have my contact available at the end. This is my friendly little gender elephant. We're going to bundle together gender and sexuality for a bit of a crash course that should provide a foundation for future discussions and understanding. Beginning with gender, when we talk about gender within the LGBTQ+ community, we often divide gender into gender identity, biological sex, and gender expression. Your biological sex is composed of the combination of hormones, chromosomes, and physical body parts that you may have. We often think of biological sex as synonymous with genitalia, but this isn't the case. The average person might fall strictly into the male or female categories when it comes to biological sex, but between 1% to 2% of the population is believed to be intersex. Intersex refers to people who may have a mix of male and female biological characteristics. They might have female chromosomes, but express male secondary sex characteristics like a lower voice or things of that sort. It's important to remember that much like gender identity, as we'll cover in the future slides, biological sex is also a spectrum. It is biology, which is hard to make binary. When we talk about gender, though, we're often talking about gender identity, or the self-identified gender of a person. A person's sex is biological, but a person's gender is a mix of cultural, psychological, and environmental factors, among others. We often think in binary terms, but multiple genders exist and have existed for as long as human culture has. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll just cover a couple terms. Cisgender refers to people who are the same gender as the one they were assigned at birth. If you were assigned male at birth, or you were given male on your birth certificate and you're still male, you are considered to be cisgender. Transgender is an umbrella term for those who do not have the same gender as the one assigned at birth. Transgender people can identify as men, women, or anywhere else on the spectrum of gender. A fairly safe umbrella term for folks who don't fit neatly into male or female categories is non-binary, or outside the binary. It's important to note that while some of us might not be familiar with the concept of gender outside of male and female, genders outside of male and female have existed for time immemorial, or at least as long as humans have. For example, there is a Cree gender called Iowakwe, which translates to one who is neither man nor woman. And finally, we have gender expression. This has everything to do with your outward appearance, how you dress, how you act, the pronouns you use. Gender expression is how you express your gender in your day-to-day life. Because expression is different for each individual, it's important to not assume someone's gender just by the way they look. If you're not sure how to refer to a person in the third person, you can ask for their pronouns. I myself use he, him, and they, them pronouns, even though I often have a very feminine appearance. Remember that expression might not reflect societal norms. Just because a person is wearing a skirt doesn't mean that they use she, her pronouns or feel comfortable being referred to as a woman. It's always polite to ask. Then there's sexuality, romantic and sexual attraction. Like with gender, it's more of a spectrum. Different people will have different labels for themselves, and no one is obligated to disclose their sexuality or their gender if they don't wish to. In case you would like to chat with your colleagues about the odd engineering student who presented this to you, my own sexuality and gender is just described as queer. It is important to remember that certain terms are closed terms. Someone who isn't Indigenous cannot identify as two-spirited, because that is a term specific to that culture. Similarly, I would recommend asking people how they identify. For example, queer is a reclaimed slur, and I use it to describe myself, but many people are uncomfortable using it to describe themselves. When in doubt, feel free to ask. You're probably familiar with a lot of terms regarding sexuality. Gay or lesbian refers to homosexual attraction or same-sex attraction. Bisexual refers to attraction to two or more genders. Heterosexual, attraction to the opposite gender, and so on and so forth. There are absolutely countless terms. I don't even know all of them. but they all express different ideas, and human beings are lovely creatures that cannot be easily summarized, so we continue to evolve our language. With that foundation laid, and with all the terms kind of out there, I'd like to talk to you about the importance of advocacy movements when it comes to gender and sexuality in the STEM field. My biggest example is the Engineers Canada 30 by 30 advocacy movement. The goal to have at least 30% of engineers being women by 2030. I will have to shout out the Yukon for having already achieved this goal. Good job, Yukon. We know that women are less likely to go into STEM in post-secondary, and more importantly, to stay in STEM. It is referred to as the quote-unquote leaky pipeline. And while engaging future students is more the purview of the educational system, I'm not an expert on high school outreach after all, we can analyze the professional landscape and be critical of our behaviors and the spaces we create. When we talk about the leaky pipeline, we're talking about the gradual diminishing return of female students and STEM workers. An Ontario study tracked grade 10 science students throughout the course of their post-secondary and into their careers. They started with a 50-50 ratio of women to men in grade 10 science. By the time the students reached grade 12, the ratio was 34 to 66, women to men. By the time we got to post-secondary, it was 20 women for 80 men. And finally, when looking at licensed engineers, it was 11 to 89. We are losing women throughout the course of post-secondary and in the professional landscape. And this isn't specific to engineering. It happens in many STEM fields. And advocacy is important. Initiatives like 30 by 30 ask us to confront the variables involved and figure out how we are creating exclusionary spaces. But oftentimes we view the gender gap only in terms of men and women, and many other aspects are forgotten. STEM can be a difficult environment for people of color, from those from certain socioeconomic backgrounds, and as I'm about to talk about, for those in the queer community, especially transgender and non-binary individuals. Queer people experience a similar process when it comes to retention in the STEM field. High school STEM spaces are often as exclusionary to queer folks as they are to women, as we've found in studies. And the same goes for post-secondary and for the professional landscape. One of our biggest predictors for the retention of students in the STEM field is participation in undergraduate research. When students participate in undergraduate research, they are much more likely than their peers to remain in the STEM field, unless they are queer. Even though queer students are more likely than their non-queer peers to participate in undergraduate research, they are still 7% less likely to stay in the field. In other words, even controlling for predictors of STEM retention, queer students are disproportionately leaving the field, whether in post-secondary or afterwards. And on this slide, I would love to give you some numbers. The wonderful thing about advocacy and movements like 30 by 30 is that they provide us with data. We know when people are leaving the field. We have data to analyze and pick apart. But there is no data for transgender and non-binary people, not just in engineering or in STEM, but in other studies as well. Even medical studies are sometimes decades behind when it comes to transgender and non-binary healthcare. We don't know the statistics for when they are leaving the field because all we have are analogies. I cannot provide you with numbers showing you how many transgender people are studying engineering now or how many stay in the field after they've graduated. But I can tell you that the number one thing I am told when attending professional development and conferences is, I've never met a trans person before. Transgender people are a novelty within the STEM field because there's just not many of us. And we're left out of a lot of advocacy movements and left to fend for ourselves. But we don't necessarily need studies or analyses To begin making changes, groups like Engiqueers exist to advocate for people who are underrepresented, and there are plenty of recommendations for how to create safer spaces. By taking the time to be thoughtful, empathetic, and willing to learn, we can prevent exclusionary practices. We have the foundations, we have the motivation, so I would like to provide you with some strategies for promoting inclusivity in your workplace and in your day-to-day life. Starting off with first impressions. Every time you introduce yourself or host an event or enter a new setting, you have the opportunity to set a tone. It could be something simple. I usually introduce myself with my pronouns, for example. And you don't need to be transgender to introduce yourself with your pronouns, because doing so sets a tone. When you introduce yourself using your pronouns, you let people know that you're working to create more inclusive spaces. Not only can this reassure marginalized individuals that may be around you that you are an ally and this is a space that is trying to be inclusive, but it can also discourage other people from exercising prejudice or discrimination. Pronouns can be added to in-person introductions, to name tags, to emails, etc. If you're planning events or work retreats, keep a goal of inclusivity in mind. Are the facilities you're booking accessible? Are there gender-neutral washrooms? Are there elevators available for those who require physical accessibility accommodations? Is your event inclusive? Do you have diverse speakers, workshops that are geared to multiple people? Let's go over an example. Liam is introducing himself at a professional event, and he uses his pronouns during his introduction. Someone asks if he's transgender. He is not, but he believes it's important to include his pronouns because you can't always tell someone's gender by their appearance, and he wants spaces he's in to be inclusive. Kai, a trans woman, now feels more comfortable sharing her own pronouns because she knows that this is a space in which she is safe to do so. Now Liam has taken a step towards creating more inclusive spaces. You can also avoid gendered language whenever you can. Language is a really important part of culture, and changing how we speak changes how we're perceived. I'm not here speaking to a pagan. I am here speaking to the engineers and geoscientists of Manitoba. There's a difference because there needs to be inclusivity. The language we use is important. Instead of using ladies and gentlemen, try honored guests. Masculine language like guys or dudes is treated as the default. And while I've never heard a professor say, hey dudes, I would both want to see that and not. Masculine language is treated as the default because it has its roots in exclusion. Masculinity used to be the default. When you walked into a room full of engineers, they were all men. That is no longer the case, and we need to change our language to reflect that. In certain cases, it might also come across as misgendering, which refers to the misattribution of gendered language to an individual. Usually when we talk about misgendering, we're talking about using the wrong pronouns for someone. For example, referring to me as she would be misgendering me. This is especially prevalent for transgender people who often feel the need to defend their identity against people who might question it or invalidate. But not everything is pre-planned, and you're not spending your days introducing yourself. So how do we contribute to inclusivity on a daily basis? Aside from educating yourself on topics you're not familiar, and we are lifelong learners as people within the STEM field, you can work on being an active ally. An active ally is someone who works towards inclusivity, addresses injustices, and provides support for their peers. If you take one thing away from this presentation, it's this: no one is ever done learning. I am still learning how to be an ally for people, and I will always be learning. But what's important is that we are willing to learn and willing to listen. So I have once again broken it down into a quick 3-step plan, although it is perhaps very much oversimplified. But it's a good strategy for preventing exclusivity. We're going to listen, learn, and lead. Listen to your peers, people in your field, people experiencing prejudice, discrimination, and barriers. Learn about things like the leaky pipeline, about misogyny and transphobia, racism, and the different forms that those types of discrimination may take. Lead where you can, set an example, make inclusive choices, and advocate for people when they cannot advocate for themselves. And lift the voices of those trying to share their experiences, only to be drowned out. Beginning with listening. Not just listening to me or people on stages and book covers, listening to your peers is important. When your coworker expresses discomfort with certain language or events, listen and try to exercise empathy. We are fantastic at problem solving in the STEM field, but the human side of things can often be trickier, and listening is a part of learning. Pay attention to the discussions you're having. What is being said? What is the implication? Be considerate when you're listening. You might not experience the same things as your peers, but try to appreciate those experiences. Observe. Once a matter is brought to your attention, you know what to look for. Take the knowledge you've gained and apply it. And when you see your peers being overlooked, try to offer them space to voice their perspectives. Going over another example, during a team meeting, Yakov notices that his coworker Robin hasn't had an opportunity to contribute and has been talked over a few times. The next time Yakov is spoken to, he gives the floor to Robin with a really quick, really casual, "Hey Robin, you've worked on a project like this. What do you make of this issue?" Now Robin is drawn into the conversation. A good team player knows how to draw people into the conversation and make brainstorming or work discussions more accessible for people who might not have as much confidence to speak up or might worry about whether or not they've earned the right to speak. In this example, once Robin is drawn into the conversation, they feel much better about offering their input because they know it's welcome. When it comes to learning, I have fantastic news. You're here, so you're already learning. You may have started to learn about gender and sexuality or inclusivity in STEM, or you might be further along in your learning journey. You can pursue educational resources offered by advocacy groups like ENGIQueers or the Canadian Indigenous Science and Engineering Society. Groups like these aim to bolster the voices of communities that are unrepresented or underrepresented in the STEM field. Seeking out resources like this one, learning about people's experiences and concerns, it's all a journey in the effort to increase inclusivity. If you don't know the answers to something or you're not well versed on a topic, reach out to people, try to find out. Advocates like myself want to talk about these things more often than not. If you would like to get even more advanced, you can read up on testimonies of folks in the STEM field who have faced oppression or discrimination, or look up studies that are done on behalf of advocacy groups to try and identify where we are becoming exclusionary and when people are leaving the field. Finally, when it comes to leading, we want to lead by example. Challenge prejudice when you see it. Intervene if you witness harassment, so long as you can do so safely. And do the work. Do the work to create the spaces that you want to be in. We all have some amount of privilege. As a white person, if I witness racism, I have a level of privilege that allows me to intervene safely. Similarly, we all have privileges that we can use to support those around us. Safe intervention might mean having a one-on-one discussion with a peer, offering an opportunity to leave an unsafe space, offering a distraction, etc. You can also set standards. Including your pronouns in an email signature might encourage your coworkers to do the same. Same with using gender-neutral language and actively attempting to make your spaces inclusive by applying strategies that you learn here and elsewhere. By setting these standards, we encourage others to follow suit. Another lovely example. During a social event, Juan notices that his coworker Yasmin is looking really uncomfortable in a one-on-one conversation with another person. He joins the conversation and asks if he can talk to Yasmin for a minute. They step to the side and Juan tells Yasmin that he noticed she looked really uncomfortable and just wanted to make sure that she was all right with the discussion. Juan has given Yasmin a way out of an uncomfortable situation, which is good because in this particular example, Yasmin was uncomfortable with the conversation and wasn't entirely sure how to leave without seeming rude or making things worse. Sometimes we can feel trapped by obligation to stay in a situation that makes us really uncomfortable. Juan could have misread the situation, and maybe Yasmin wasn't actually uncomfortable with the discussion. Juan may have made it awkward for a moment, but that's a pretty fair price to pay when the alternative would be to leave a friend or coworker stranded in an uncomfortable situation. Generally speaking, an awkward moment is usually a fair price to pay for the opportunity to create inclusive and safer spaces. Mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. We all make mistakes because we're human. Discomfort comes from these mistakes, but discomfort is kind of your brain's way of saying something here needs to change. If you're feeling uncomfortable, that just means that you need to assess the situation and do some critical thinking about why and how you can alleviate that. If you're trying to change your language, for example, and you slip in an accidental, "Hey guys," that's okay. Correct yourself and move on. It's important to do this even when you're not under scrutiny. For example, if you've accidentally referred to someone by the wrong pronouns, even though it was simply in your head or on your own, don't panic. Acknowledge that you've made a mistake, correct it, and move on. You can also correct others when possible, politely if you can. Another example. Chow and Melissa are talking about a mutual friend, Morgan, who has recently come out as non-binary. Chow accidentally misgenders Morgan, and Melissa corrects him. He thanks her for the correction, reminds himself to practice using the correct pronouns, and continues speaking. You'll notice that Chow did not stop the conversation and make a terribly big deal about apologizing for the mistake, because it was just a mistake. It wasn't done purposefully or done with the intent to harm anyone. When you dwell on mistakes or make a big deal out of apologizing, it can often put the burden of forgiveness on someone else. Just accept the correction. You could even say thank you if you would like, and move on. We know that there's a gender gap in STEM, and we know that there are people who fall through the cracks and don't find support in the professional community. Feelings of isolation, judgment, and discrimination can drive our peers not only out of post-secondary, but out of the professional landscape. As STEM workers, we tend to pride ourselves on our problem-solving skills, and it can be difficult when we don't have hard data for our queer coworkers or other underrepresented groups that simply don't have the studies to back up the analogies that we know are happening. Ongoing professional development is an opportunity to improve our own skill sets and the strategies that we can use to help solve the issue of exclusionary spaces. We don't need the numbers to begin changing things. Due to the on-demand nature of this presentation, I am unable to take live questions. However, I invite you to reach out should you have any follow-up questions or feedback on this presentation. And if you would like to learn more about queer representation in engineering or transgender representation in engineering, feel free to reach out to either myself or to EngiQueers as a whole. Thank you very much for attending this presentation and have a lovely conference.
Thank you for watching. Visit the Ingenium On Demand library for more exclusive content.